Welcome to the Filmmaker Mixer Podcast, the podcast by filmmakers for filmmakers.
This episode is sponsored by Gemini Crown Tech, software for all of your production needs. Stay tuned for more information later in the show. Hello, everybody. This is the Filmmaker Mixer Podcast, and today we are talking art and science and the search for meaning. We have filmmaker Mark Levinson on the show. He is talking about his new film, The Universe in a Grain of Sand. So, Mark, welcome to the show.
It's very nice to be here. Thanks, Jeff.
Well, I'm looking forward to this conversation. My dad was a philosophy teacher and professor, and so I'm ready to jump into the meaning of life with you and art and science and all that good stuff. So, just for the context of the show, so the audience understands what we're talking about, give us the pitch on your film. Tell us what it's all about.
So the story, of course, I have many versions of the pitch and many lengths, but the shortest version is that it's a meditation on the way both scientists and artists try to understand the world. And the fact is that both artists and scientists, in my mind, use tools that are based on their understanding of nature to further understand nature. And so I was interested in looking at that parallel and seeing how, in some sense, our understanding of nature enables further understanding of nature, and how both artists and scientists using this present complementary views that I think are important to have our most complete picture of the universe.
And what do you think is the biggest difference in the way, say, a scientist sees the world through their tools and an artist?
Yeah, well, it's a very interesting question. I mean, I think that in the film, I actually emphasize the parallels at various points in terms of how our advances in understanding nature allowed new technologies, new techniques that artists have also adapted, and are also, in my mind, I mean, the best artists are trying to give a representation of the world that provides understanding. I'd say I think the biggest difference is that scientists want a representation or explanation of the universe that anybody, anywhere would actually have the same result for. Any experiment, I mean, if it's a universal theory, it should be the same wherever you are and whoever's looking at it. Whereas I'd say artists' view of the world is a more personal and reactional sort of experience that I think most artists are not demanding or even really interested in a singular interpretation of what their work means. It's more of an individual, impressionistic, personal experience. So I think that's what I've decided in this process, because this has come up, and of course I was thinking about it a lot, and in the film, in fact, I actually talk about this. It was not something that I had at the beginning. And as I was working through the film and thinking myself about this, I realized that that's, I think, the primary difference. That scientists, they want something that's reproducible, that's repeatable anywhere, whereas that's obviously not the case for art.
And so where did you get the idea for this particular film? How did this germinate in your brain and become a reality?
I've always been interested in the overlap between art and science. I think maybe out of self-justification, because I started by getting a PhD in physics and then moved into film, and have had so many people ask me, like, well, how did you do that? And it's so strange and so different. But for me, there were parallels right from the beginning. I mean, that I saw film, when I moved into film, as in some sense also a theory of how the universe works. And I really saw it as, I saw this parallel, although I don't think I was explicitly as conscious of it or could have stated it as clearly. But this was something that was of interest to me. And specifically for this project, what happened is, I met Dario Gil, who was at the time the director of international research at IBM. And I had friends at IBM that kept telling me that Dario was a huge fan of a previous film of mine called Particle Fever. And in particular, the thing that he was actually using in talks was a segment in Particle Fever where Savas Dimopoulos, who was a very eminent theoretical particle physicist, talked about what distinguishes a truly great scientist. And in his mind, what really distinguished the scientist is, as he said, you need to have a modicum of intelligence. But what really distinguishes a great scientist is having an artistic taste to understand, to identify a problem that hasn't been solved, that was beautiful, that would have important consequences, but the time for solving it has come now. And so Dario picked up on this artistic element and this question of choice, which for me is parallel there's a parallel between artists and scientists. I mean, how does an artist decide what to do? What's their object going to be? And same as that as the scientists. And so Dario was interested in getting together, and so he said he'd love to have a dinner. And I went and we had a dinner and we were talking about all these things, and he started telling me that he thinks that technology and computers are at an interesting inflection point, that in some ways we're reaching the limits of what we can do with classical semiconductor computers, and that we may be going back to analog in some ways, and that he thought this was good. And when I first met him, I walked into his office. There was a poster, a famous poster of Glenn Gould from when he first recorded the Goldberg variations in the 50s, and that was also an interesting thing. So we had an interesting conversation, and then the suggestion was, well, could I ever think about doing a film for them? And I was not interested in doing a film about IBM. I was not interested in doing I'm not interested in doing science films, which are, for me, a science film is a film where it's, from the beginning, it's designed to explain science. But I actually was finishing up with my very previous film, which was a film about Claude Shannon called The Bit Player. And I was taking it around to festivals, and I would go and I would look at IBM research labs. And I was sort of astonished. I didn't realize how much they were doing pure research. I really thought that, it was typically much more focused on technology. And so I began to think about the tools and the use of computers and what Dario was saying about the transformation and how, in some sense, these progressions to other things like AI or quantum computing is so dependent on what we understand about nature, and how that could be this theme. A sort of a narrative through line is how we have progressed as we've understood nature. And honestly, I'm trying to remember the very first time I thought about using the works of artists. But I've never liked, again, I didn't want this to be a typical science film where I hire some animators to explain the ideas. To me, that was not the theme. The film is not about explaining the science. The film is about showing these different things, in particular, the works of artists, the works of scientists, and letting people draw their own conclusions. And so there was a practical aspect too, is I thought, okay, I could hire some graphic designers, animation people. I've had some great people I've worked with, or I could look for things that are already existing that captured something in my mind. And I was familiar with certain works by experimental filmmakers, and it had always struck me that certain concepts like in quantum mechanics, the idea of superposition, for instance, it's there's very typical ways that it's represented, in a scientific way, but early experimental filmmakers, they were playing with superposing images, and you don't think twice about it. You look at something, you see two images on top of each other, you don't think, "Oh my God, how's that happening?" I mean, if you saw two people sort of superimposed in real life, of course you totally freak out. But the idea that, maybe artists' representations of things was a different way to represent concepts, and people would sort of go, "Well, yeah, okay, I get that." As opposed to, having some particular detailed technical drawing, and people would really not get it at all unless they really understood graphs and things like that. So I had this idea of not using explanatory animations, but finding the works of other artists. And so that was sort of the genesis, that have this basic arc, but see if I could find the works of artists that would resonate with me in an explanatory, not explanatory, but suggestive way with the idea, so that this film could show scientists a different way to look at the things that they are talking about, and maybe show artists a different perspective on science and how it may relate to their work.
Well, I'm curious now that you've made the film and you've delved into art and science and all this subject matter. Did you learn anything from making the film that changed your view of the world in any way?
Well, honestly, it gave me a better appreciation of some of these artists, which I knew, but I was not an expert on, and I don't know. I honestly can't say that I understood them in a certain sense. So, in a very practical way, the way the film evolved was I sort of got approval to start making it just at the beginning of COVID, and so I probably typically the way I would have started is I would have gone around and started to do interviews with some people and see where that was leading. I didn't really have a script, so it was really, I had these vague ideas, but because I couldn't interview anybody, and I had this idea that I wanted to incorporate artists, and in particular initially it was, in particular I was thinking about experimental filmmakers and avant-garde filmmakers, and so I hired two professors of experimental film. And so for several months, we would just have a Zoom call every week, and I would sort of talk to them about the science, and they would suggest various filmmakers to look at. And it was really revelatory. It was fantastic. I mean, as I said, I knew something, but I was by no means an expert. And it really gave me an appreciation for some of the works that these people were doing, and gave me some interesting, in-depth feeling about it. So I'd say that was a major development in the process of this. And I mean, in the technology side, I mean, I obviously I have a science background, so I understood the basic science, but I was not an expert in semiconductors and computing and AI and quantum computing in particular. So that was a not complete deviation for me, but it was definitely something that I needed to look at and understand in a way that related to the story. So I guess those two different strands. I mean, learning more about the science and how it's related to nature. I mean, I think also the other thing is it really gave me an appreciation for nature in a weird way. I mean, even though in some sense I'm following the technology, because I think one of the instrumental, there was another very instrumental thing is I saw this film by a filmmaker named Aaron Espily called the Lanthanide series. And there's a clip of it in the film, actually. And it's a very poetic film, but um, one of her segments talks about the Lanthanide series, which is a series, it's called the Rare Earth Elements. It's in the news a lot lately because it's the basis of so much in technology. And it turns out that China is the people that actually produce it the most. But what was interesting to me is I hadn't thought about that fact that here are these elements in the periodic table that are the basis of all of our modern technology. And how, in some sense, it just struck me like some of our knowledge and our understanding and the way we compute the universe is based on dirt. And so I think there is often this feeling of this division between nature and technology. I mean, I think most people just think it's like computers just fell out of the sky intact, and it's some sort of natural element itself. And so that was a motivating factor, is realizing it is nature. I mean, that technology isn't alien and separate from nature. It is nature, and in a sense, it represents our best understanding of nature. That what we understand about it, we are trying to we're trying to duplicate in some sense. We're trying to get as good as nature in some sense, because nature is so much better than us in terms of managing to survive. I mean, we may kill ourselves off, but there's still going to be, nature will go on.
Well, I'm always curious when it comes to filmmakers because we all bring to our storytelling, things about ourselves, things about, things we've studied, who we are affects our storytelling. So I'm curious for you as a filmmaker, how does your science background, and I'm not talking necessarily about subject matter in this one, like science and art and things like that, but how does your science background, do you think, affect you as a storyteller, or
Hmm.
does it?
I mean, I probably have a certain logic that I apply to things. Um, the physics that I did was very abstract. Um,
Interesting. Wait, what did you do?
so
When you say abstract, what did you do? What kind of physics did you do?
it was theoretical particle physics. And so, even in theory, so first of all, in physics, there's an enormous separation and division between theorists and experimentalists, people that do the theories and people that do the experiments. And in the theorist side, there's a spectrum of people that are doing theory, but they're closer to experiment. They're dealing with data. They're trying to, make models of nature that explain that are tied to the general theoretical principles, but they're called model builders, really. At the other extreme end are the people that are working in almost complete abstraction, and they're working, often at the foundations of the theories and the intricacies of the mathematics, and what does the mathematics reveal. I was on that extreme experiment theoretical end. So which is, it almost is like art. In fact, I joked that I met more experimental physicists when I made my film Particle Fever than when I was actually a physicist, when I was working in the field. So I think, in terms of how did that affect my filmmaking, I think it was, I mean, maybe it was more of an openness to abstraction and theory. Um, I think that, I mean, maybe that's why I was more open to experimental films, that when I moved into film, I was not interested in, thinking I was going to go to Hollywood and make the next big blockbuster. In fact, when I first got interested in film, I got interested in Eastern European cinema. And to me, it was this revelation that people could make films about the human condition that were incredibly complex and layered, and represented something bigger about how the universe works. And so that's the direction I went in. And I did end up working on bigger films. But luckily, mostly I had some close associations with some filmmakers that made also deep and substantial films. I worked a lot with Anthony Minghella in particular, and so I worked on English Patient, Talented Mr. Ripley, and so um, I think my science wasn't. I wouldn't say I look. I mean, I'm analytical in a sense that I can look at story, but I would say that my narrative filmmaking skills really affected the way I told films about science than the other way around. Because that's when I first got involved in film. I didn't dream about doing documentaries, certainly not anything about science. I was interested in fiction films. I wanted to make American equivalent of Eastern European cinema. And as I said, didn't make any documentaries, didn't nothing. I had no interest in making a film about science. I was interested in making a fictional film that treated science in an intrinsic way, not just not just gratuitously. So that had been a goal of mine, and I had been looking for a project, and then another fiction project fell through, and I heard about this physicist that wanted to make a film about CERN, the big collider where they discovered the Higgs boson, and he hadn't been able to get anything done really, and I contacted him and said, look, this is my field. I absolutely understand it. I know what the stakes are, and I think this could be it could almost be a narrative film, even though it will be based on people. And that, if that's of interest, then I would love to do it. And so I got interested in making a film about physics because I could see that it could be a nice story. And that's more of my interest is again, not explaining science, but talking about the process, showing the creative process in its generality, showing how scientists work, and subliminally, I guess, already starting to think about the parallels between art and science.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Well, before we wrap up, tell folks how they can hear more about your film and tell us where it's going to be screening next.
Yes, it's going to be screening at the Portland Festival of Cinema, Animation, and Technology. It's going to be screening on August 9th at the OMSI Museum Theater, which I'm excited about because I showed Particle Fever at that big, beautiful screen many years ago, and it seems like the perfect place to do it. And I will be out there, and people can follow where it's available. We have a very nice website at grainofsandmovie.com, www.grainofsandmovie.com, and there's a trailer so people can see what we're talking about here at all, and a little bit more about there's over 41 artists whose works are in the film, and it's not just experimental filmmakers, and that's something that also evolved as I was making the film. I mean, I knew I wanted to do this. It was a very long process of accepting that I need to declare this right at the beginning of the film and, bring in other artists and things like that. So we have all of the artists listed and the people, the sort of more science and tech people listed, and there'll be updates about where it can be. So hopefully we have a distributor, or hopefully eventually it'll be available on some streaming platform, but the best place to see it is up on a big screen. So
Oh, absolutely. Well, Portland's a great festival. You'll have fun up there, and you will be there to do Q&As with the
yeah,
audience.
I will. Yes.
Awesome, awesome. Well, it's a great film. I really enjoyed it. Like I said, my dad taught philosophy. I'm interested in those big questions, and you did a great job tackling some of that in the film. Circle back later and let us know what you're up to next.
I will. I have a very good project. So my dream of trying to make something that's a fictional story, I'm hoping is going to be realized with an adaptation of a novel by Richard Powers called The Goldbug Variations. So
Oh,
Richard,
nice.
yeah. Do you know that novel or?
I've heard of it. I've never read it,
Yeah.
but I know
Yeah.
a wee bit about
Yeah.
it. But that's
Yeah.
fascinating.
So Powers, Powers, I think, has a brilliant sense of, he understands science, but he also understands music and art. And he now, of course, became very famous for writing The Overstory, which won the Pulitzer. But this is an older one, and it really looks at, well, basically two parallel stories revolving around a molecular biologist who's on the verge of discovering the code for life, how DNA works, and he's derailed by falling in love with this scientist in his lab who introduces him to music, in particular Bach and the Goldberg variations. And so it sort of weaves together, DNA and Bach and music and science. And so I hope that'll be the next thing.
Well, that sounds fascinating. Well, if that happens, definitely the door is always open. Circle
Yeah.
back and we'll chat about that project. That sounds fun.
Great. That sounds great to me too.
All right. Well, you take care and best of luck in Portland. I'm sure it'll be fun.
Okay. Thanks very much.
All right. You take care.
This episode is sponsored by Gemini Crown Tech, owned and operated by Stephanie Moore and Stephanie Harrison. We at Gemini Crown Tech have covered all your production management needs with our proprietary software. Please visit our website at www.geminicrowntech.com and use the code FMP for Filmmaker Mixer Podcast listeners, so we know how you heard about us.
Thank you for listening to the Filmmaker Mixer Podcast, a podcast created and hosted by filmmakers Jeff Stolen and Andrew Lamping, and produced by Melody Lopez.
Our theme song was composed by Stephen D. Bennett.
Make sure to follow or subscribe on whatever platform you're listening to us on, and stay tuned for future episodes.